Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to explain why Ridgefield failed and why it seems almost every work of social improvement, familial, economical, spiritual, cultural, educational, etc., also seems to fail. No matter how much energy we put into these works of betterment, they fall flat again and again and again. And before we get too long in the tooth, although very related to where we're going here, the advertisement, the opening chant was the Asparagus May from the Western Mass. And I'm reminded of the old line by the British composer Haydn, who said he would trade his whole au revoir for one cantata of Bach's. And I think I would do as much, and I would trade a whole lot of my MP3s and my CDs and all of this jazz in order to get the asparagus, in order to keep the Asparagus May. The Asparagus May is the blessing of holy water in the Latin rite at the beginning of Holy Mass. That's the chant. We'll get to the image soon enough, but actually all of this is related. The Asparagus May, the book here, An Excess of Love, which is your advertisement, and indeed the humble tortoise. So where we're going here is a brief stroll down memory lane and an analysis of why the high school in Ridgefield, the so-called traditional, so-called Catholic high school in Ridgefield I was once associated with, collapsed. We are now in the octave of St. Ignatius of Loyola on the 31st of July. So I'm recording this and broadcasting this sometime within those 8 days from then counting. And this is indeed a wistful time of year for me, as certain times are, because it was both the anniversary of my coming to Ridgefield and my going. They both happened, believe it or not, on the exact same day. When I was a little bit younger, at 17 years of age, the Feast of St. Ignatius, completely by random, was the day I came to this location, and that feast day had a certain significance for those people. And some years later, I think 12 years later, it happened to be the exact same day, the 31st of July, that one of the 501c3 corporate horror priests told me to get lost. So what coincidence? There is no such thing, of course. But nevertheless, without begrudging St. Ignatius at all, I did go on to write a book about those 12 years with the so-called traditional, so-called Catholics, and particularly looking at the school that I'll be alluding to here. And here we have a beautiful publication from Apocatastasis Press, and so you can access this text by going to Apocatastasis Press's site, which is linked below. Then you can see all of our great text, including in this month of Holy August of 2025, Dr. R. Michael Fisher's Fear and Cultural Vocabulary text. We've just rolled that out and we're taking pre-orders for it right now. But your advertisement concerns this text. So if you want the nitty-gritty of my conclusion in this broadcast and a lot of personal anecdotes and memories from this most significant era of my life. And I should hope, as I hope in this broadcast, to not just have a personal recollection, but really to provide some sociological food for thought and hopefully lessons to learn and mistakes to learn from, myself included. Anyway, An Excess of Love deals with my 12 years in Ridgefield with that 501c3 organization. And here, while we're on the topic, is the Apocatastasis Press page. And you can see all of the good stuff we have. There's Vladimir's book. Here's Holy Compline. Excuse me. And all sorts of good stuff. So, as I said in a recording, in fact, not this recording. Why is this? This should not be here. This should be my conversation with Michael. I'm glad I caught this. How on earth did this video get under this book? Anyway, that's strange altogether. Anyway, as I said in the illusory conversation with Michael, which I will fix on this site immediately after broadcasting, as we move at ApocatastasisInstitute for a physical location, we really cannot be reliant on tuition. And we need income, and that income has to be more regular. And so part of that's going to be Apocatastasis Press. You'll be hearing much more about that going forward. So please do patronize these books, including An Excess of Love. All right. So whether it's that text or our Asparagus May, which I began with, or this turtle, indeed, what we're looking at is a work of betterment. This so-called traditional, so-called Catholic high school in Ridgefield, which I was heading up for any number of years after the family initially drove off the founders of that school. It kind of fell into my lap, and fanatic that I clearly am, I soldiered on until my presence was no longer wanted. And literally the second, this is the only endearing aspect to me, and that is literally the high school collapsed immediately after that decision. So I've understood, having followed the bulletins from this 501c3 corporation, that they've in the past year attempted to revive the high school, and I wish whoever is in charge of that all the luck in the world, because it will fail because the same souls are involved. And the key to this presentation and the key to An Excess of Love from Apocatastasis Press is the bourgeois spirit. This is the nerve. This is the absolute nerve why works of betterment fall apart. It doesn't matter how true, how wholesome, how good, how Christ-oriented, how Vishnu-oriented, how Islamically inspired, whatever truth is to you. We're not going to have that discussion here. Whatever goodness is and righteousness and mercy, rahmah, whatever that is to you, have you not noticed that all of these works of betterment fall apart? If you've ever been involved with something like a high school or a co-op or any number of things, you'll notice they never endure. And often they do not endure because they have committed seppuku. They have destroyed themselves. They have ripped out their guts. And the key to that is the bourgeois spirit. It is the middle class spirit. So in this presentation, on this, for me, wistful anniversary, I want to analyze that. I want to analyze that with one of the most important essays, which is forgotten today. And that is Catholicism and the Bourgeois Mind. Now, I did not just stutter, because we're looking at a screen share called Catholics and the Bourgeois Mind. This is an intro article, basically a summary from Thomas Stork of a somewhat longer article, not really that much longer, by Christopher Dawson from the 1950s. And we're going to look at that. And so whether you have any interest in Catholicism or not, I go back and forth depending on the day, let's say. Um, this article and this analysis is very insightful for understanding why all sorts of holy and happy works engaged in by wholesome people fall apart because it has to do with not the ideology in this case for this author and the preceding inspirational text, Catholicism in the bourgeois mind, not because of the ideology, the spirituality, or whatever, but rather because of this. If you can see my cursor, which I always fear that you can't, but I always see it on the post recording, this aspect, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the reality is the middle class mind, the middle class soul cannot endure for betterment. And that is the mistake we again and again and again and again make. I don't care if you have nothing to do with Catholicism or with high schools or the immediate topics which concern a fair amount of my ruminations in this book and indeed during all those days since. None of that really matters. What matters for our time together in this broadcast is the fact that the bourgeois thinking and the spirit of the middle class man is antithetical to greatness. It is antithetical to holiness. It is antithetical to excellence. And what's happening is a lot of people who are striving for excellence are bourgeois. And this is creating constant flops, constant deflations, constant fizzle outs, constant destruction of, well, high schools in Ridgefield. Now, before proceeding, we have two things to get into. One of which is to explain why I chose a tortoise for the opening image as well as the thumbnail of this broadcast. And then the second, which we must immediately address, is the background music. And I must expand the repertoire. So whenever you see the blue in the background of these recordings you have for the past fortnight, that means that I have run out of free hours on the other channel, or rather the other uh, page. I don't know. What do you call it on subscription sites when the other platform? I don't know. But anyway, I tap that out. So whenever you see the blue background, that's what they give me on the second recording studio. How about that? Studio. And right now we only have soothing Irish music. This is what they tell me. Although the opening song is actually of an English British poem, "Oh Danny Boy," although it's associated with cheesy Irish funerals. Okay. Which is interesting because that comes from a poem. It actually is an interesting piece, "Oh Danny Boy," because the narrator is standing on top of someone's grave and kind of talking to them. Anyway, I don't wanna derail things because, there's the ongoing World War One section of our project that brings to mind. Anyway, you've your background music, but you don't have any explanation of this tortoise. So in this recording, I really don't have too many axes to grind. I do all of my axe grinding in an excess of love, and I think it's all very good-humored, all things considered. Uh, but in this wistful, though I should think, very lighthearted, um, opening minutes, we have our tortoise, and that is because in Ridgefield, and I should think 100 years before and 100 years after, long after our time is over, we have turned to dust, our children have turned to dust. This tortoise, not this particular tortoise, but there was a tortoise in Ridgefield that would come up every year out of Lake Memenasco, where this location may or may not have been located around. And this dutiful beast would, with its poor little legs there, crawl up the hill. This again is not the actual photograph of the tortoise, but every year in the springtime, Mrs. Tortoise would come up and would lay her eggs about the property, presumably, would certainly circumambulate the property. And every year, the little boys would find this thing every single year, and they would put it in trash cans. They would never hurt the thing, of course. Children do not by nature hurt animals. Men do that when they grow up, but not children. Uh, Occasionally, though, they would kidnap Mrs. Tortoise and put the thing inside of a garbage can until the teachers would yell at them, and then set Mrs. Tortoise on her way. And I have many, many happy memories of Ridgefield, and I try to get into that in the book. Whatever grouchiness I have, I do have happy memories of Mrs. Tortoise and all sorts of other animals that crossed our path, and indeed all sorts of other uh, uh, let's see, two-legged animals that crossed my path as well. So I dedicate this rumination to Mrs. Tortoise. And with that being said, we now get into Catholics in the bourgeois mind, because those 12 years for me, you see, were very interesting. There were times of growth. I certainly learned a lot about administration, and indeed about classroom practice, as hopefully one would after 12 years. And I learned on the job, and I did appreciate this particular sect of Protestants. They were Catholics in the sense, in their minds they were. They were Catholics in the sense that they were super positive about the Catholic aesthetic. They were Catholics in the sense that they were really hot for the Western liturgy. But strangely enough, they were not actually Catholics. And that led to a whole other level here, which I get into in the book. And actually, this actually does get into an aspect of the bourgeois, but I don't want to derail things too much here. Unlike most Protestants, this particular church didn't focus on the Holy Bible, as a central focus, but rather on the Holy Liturgy, which I think led a lot of people to think they were attending a Catholic church. And in fact, I would go so far as to say almost every single person there actually did believe they were Catholics. But like every Protestant, this particular sect had redefined what that word is. I don't want to get too much into the sectarian, except this does allow me to bring up an aspect of bourgeois Christianity. And again, if you're not interested in the maybe the religious dynamics of the group I was formerly associated with, what I would encourage you in this presentation is to focus on the bourgeois, because you can switch out the ideology, you can switch out the tool, so to speak, for betterment. And it doesn't matter, because as long as the bourgeois spirit and the bourgeois mind obtain, nothing good that you work for, your soup kitchen, your pro-life work, your educational work, your work for family development, your cultural work, your educational stuff, none of that is going anywhere, much less your political work, as long as you have the bourgeois mind and the bourgeois spirit at play in the people you're interacting with. But when it comes to bourgeois Christianity of whatever sect, they tend to have certain eccentricities in our day, particularly around the sexual and around the doctrinal. And that is because Western Christians have lost almost every aspect of life. They have had to cede ground, CEDE. They have had to surrender land to modernity, to secularism, whatever. And the only two redoubts that Western Christians of whatever sect still have some illusory control over, because it at least affects them, would be the sexual and the doctrinal. And so you'll notice that Western Christians almost did the complete abandonment of every other aspect of Christianity, which once was a totalitarian system in at least a neutral, not a positive sense of that word. Although it tends to have a negative sense, totalitarian. That's neither good nor bad necessarily. But the Christians have surrendered all the goodness of the totalitarianism of Christianity, and all they have left are sexual ethics and doctrinal hair splitting. And they do that to a T, which is why you'll notice, as modernity continues to move along, Western Christianity continues to splinter and splinter. And this is not just Protestantism, but it's also amongst a lot of people who believe they're Catholic as well. And you'll notice across the Christian spectrum, a total neuroses about sexual topics. You should actually start your stopwatch. Start your stopwatch. You can start your clock. And see how long it is before you meet a 501c3 corporate whore Christian and the time they start talking about sexual morality. I'd be interested to know the numbers that you hear. But really, this myopia in this particular group, I don't mean just in Ridgefield, but 501c3 corporate whore Christians, this myopia, you're going to see it across the board because the problem is the bourgeois. The problem isn't Catholicism. The problem isn't even Protestantism. The problem isn't the Democratic Party. The problem isn't tariffs. The problem isn't public school. The problem isn't private school. The problem isn't St. Karen's homeschool group, which had a lot to do with why Ridgefield High School fell apart, which I get into here. A certain homeschool group wraithing about Western Connecticut. We're not even going to talk about all of that. The problem is the bourgeois spirit. Now, this allows me, before we get into this article, to make two caveats. One of which is to be bourgeois does not directly press on if you have so-and-so amount of Federal Reserve notes in the bank. To be bourgeois, strictly speaking, the way that I am using it, the way that Stork is using this word, the way that Dawson before him and before me uses the word bourgeois, does not directly refer to the income of Federal Reserve notes that you get every year, your money, so-called, that comes in. To be bourgeois is to have a certain way of looking at the world. That is what makes it. It's very similar to being a Jew. A Jew is a horrible thing. However, the dudes down in Brooklyn and Long Island and New Jersey, more Jews, they say, of the flesh, live in those areas, except out of Israel. So the most so-called Jews live in Israel, and then outside of it is the areas I just mentioned here in America. New York City, Long Island, and northern New Jersey. And I can attest to that with my own eyes. There's a massive amount of those people. However, to be a Jew in the horrible negative parasitical sense that it has usually been used in Western culture does not directly equate with being from Central Europe, Ashkenazi, or Sephardim, does not directly press on being from those people, being circumcised, not eating shellfish, not eating cheeseburgers. Because in the kosher laws, you cannot mix meat and milk. It does not mean going to a synagogue and blowing a horn all night and wearing curly hair and big black coats in July. That doesn't make you a Jew as far as Western culture is concerned, as far as Christian culture is concerned. To be a Jew, in the parasitical, horrible, negative sense of the word, which is pretty much the sense that has existed in the West for 2,000 years, and actually you can take it actually much farther back to the prophet Jeremiah, but that's another discussion. The point is, it doesn't, having curls and being circumcised and not eating cheeseburgers doesn't make you a Jew. All these people online right now talking about the Jew and talk about the Jew and name the Jew, they don't even know what they're talking about. To be a Jew is to be like the bourgeois. It is a spiritual and mental category before it is a physical category. So these sentiments, these ways of thinking and behaving might, in fact, nest for the bourgeois predominantly in a group of people that has a certain income, but it does not exclusively nest in such people. Likewise, to be a Jew does not, yes, all the negative parasitical attributes may nest amongst a certain group of people on this earth, but it is not exclusive to them. Likewise, let's flip the script. Likewise, being a Christian, and you can whatever you want, being a Muslim, being a Chinaman, whatever, does not exclusively reside either in the physical. There was a Protestant pastor, he was called Billy Sunday, and he was on the radio about 100 years ago. And Billy Sunday very wisely said, being a Christian by sitting in church is as ridiculous as saying being a car is sitting in your garage. If you go into your garage and you sit in it, do you become a car? You can sit in it as long as you want, just sitting on the floor of your garage. You do not become a car. And there are dynamics. There are dynamics to things. Even I said the Chinaman. You say, what? How can you become a... Well, the British knew this when they conquered the world, right? They would occasionally have soldiers and officers that went native. I think there's the American book. He's actually, I think, from Poland, Joseph Conrad, but he's an American author in the same way that T.S. Eliot, he's from America, but he's a British author. Conrad has his Captain Kurtz, right? Captain Kurtz goes native. He goes native. And the British saw that, and yeah, you can become a Chinaman. If you live, you can become these cultures. It's not limited to the flesh, and to be bourgeois is not limited to your income. The point I'm making in all of these similes, and I hope I haven't confused you, is that to be bourgeois is not directly connected to your income. It is directed to how you look at the world and how you behave towards others. And that's what we will see here, and what we're having with Catholics. And you can flip in whatever other sect of whatever part of society. It doesn't have to be religious, that you please. The problem is we have people that are fundamentally bourgeois, and they are covering themselves like cheap clothing in these ideologies which may, like Catholicism, be quite robust, like Judaism might, for that matter, be quite robust. Whatever, like Chinese culture can be quite robust. But the problem you're having is that the body in the clothing is bourgeois. To be bourgeois, and now we're going to get into the article, means how you think and how you act. It has only secondary, only peripheral bearing on how much income you're making. So just because you're making within an income bracket, the middle class bourgeois income, does not necessarily mean that you are bourgeois. Just like if you're down in the Bronx and you have to eat that yummy kosher hot dog with your big black coat in July, does not make you a Jew in the New Testament true sense of the word, which is a fundamentally negative sense of the word. So there is the caveat. And then the other caveat, a little bit long in the tooth for the recording to bring this up, but it is worth bringing up. Whenever I am hostile, yes, that is a fine word, or peevish, towards, in this case, traditional Catholics, so-called, in Western Connecticut, I do want to point out that there is a distinctly nasty attitude which attends that community in this part of the world. And I also need to balance that with the reality that a lot of those same people belong to another nasty group, distinctive for being nasty in Western Connecticut and Eastern New York, called homeschoolers. And I do want to just acknowledge that whether it's in this presentation or in this book or in certain other texts that I've written, such as, let's see if we can dig it up. What's the one? What is the one, the naturist one that I'm thinking of? I've written so many books, I've forgotten about them. Here we go. Pearls Before Swine, right? So whether it's that or Pearls Before Swine, I do want to bring to your attention, to mine, that I'm very conscious that both the Christians in Western Connecticut of the traditional Catholic sect of Protestants, as well as the homeschoolers who often overlap them, are distinctly and uniquely nasty. And there is an absolute problem of comportment amongst those two overlapping communities. And I do not want to slander or denigrate people who belong to those communities outside of Western Connecticut and Eastern New York. Those who live within those boundaries really need to work on quality control, because there are some serious problems that are absolutely discrediting your interests. And I'll just leave it there. But here we go. The bourgeois mind, or rather, Catholics in the bourgeois mind. I don't know if something got cut off here, but this is by Thomas Stork. Okay, so here we go. And we'll blow this up so that it's readable. Now, again, this is the intro essay to the Christopher Dawson article. And Christopher Dawson, who was a historian in the middle of the last century, and a Catholic historian, and unlike most of these Catholic historians, he was actually a legit historian. Christopher Dawson was also very interested in these sociological aspects. So here we go. And he is well worth rediscovering. Just like Chesterton and Belloc had been forgotten for about 50 years, more famously, Shakespeare had been forgotten for about 200 years. Christopher Dawson, such a man, he well deserves, especially amongst Catholics, to be revived and his work to be brought back. And I think there's a reason it hasn't been brought back, because there is a niche, obviously, on this website, now defunct. There is a niche of Catholics that are aware of Dawson. In fact, I think the reason Dawson is not brought up and has been largely forgotten in a way that Chesterton and Belloc haven't been is because of the very point that he's making about the bourgeois mind. The very sort of Catholics, so-called, who would be interested in Catholic culture in the sort that Dawson was writing about, and a truly historically trained mind. Sometimes, for instance, Belloc is called a Catholic historian. He's not. He's a propagandist. He's an interesting propagandist. He's a propagandist well worth reading. But Belloc is not a historian in the modern sense of the word. He's written a lot about history, but at no point when you read Hilaire Belloc, or for that matter, G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a rebuttal to H.G. Wells's outline of history, The Everlasting Man, in no sense are Belloc and Chesterton actually historians. They're propagandists. Maybe they make very good points. Dawson's different. He is a truly analytical historical mind who will often, in his day and age in particular, offer a revisionist or a counter narrative, which was unheard of in his day, and still is on a minority. But the point is, Dawson. Well, that's interesting. I'm thinking out loud right now. Belloc and Chesterton, I think, did critique the bourgeois mind, but they never said it out loud. I mean, they certainly critiqued capitalism, but that hasn't prevented their being revived in the English-speaking world and amongst the so-called conservatives. For some reason that I can't figure out, capitalism is held up as being conservative. It's the most radical ideology in human history. Is it that because these so-called conservative, so-called Catholics just ignore it? I mean, maybe that's the problem of so-called traditional, so-called Catholicism, is they just pick and choose. Maybe that's the problem of Catholicism. It's so big according to its own calling, to encompass all of human life, thought, actions, interior life, spirituality, economic. I mean, Catholicism in its broadest sense is massive. Is the revival of Chesterton and Belloc due to the fact that people can just ignore the anti-capitalism of those gentlemen and just play up the parts where they're poning the libs? And the reason that Dawson has not been revived, I think the reason, and I'll put a sock in it here, I got to think through this some more. I think the reason Christopher Dawson has been still forgotten when Belloc and Chesterton have been revived in these very devout spheres is because, yes, Dawson names the nerve of the problem, is that the problem with modernity is the thinking and actions of the bourgeoisie. And there are people of that thinking and acting who are very, very often intrigued by various forms of so-called conservative, so-called Christianity, who are, even deeper than that, bourgeois. And the fact that Dawson says that it is the bourgeois spirit which is antithetical to the spirit of Christ, he says it out loud in a way that Belloc and Chesterton don't. I think that explains why Dawson is still forgotten, except for super niche things like what the Distributist Review was. And I also think because Dawson was a more prosaic writer and boring, and because he was a legit historian, shame on the history profession, mea culpa, historians have a horrible tendency to write boring text. For some reason, they think it makes them into like a unique elite club. Whereas Belloc and Chesterton were popular authors, especially Chesterton, right? He was a newspaper man. So he was used to, doing the zinger, getting the lead in the newspaper, right? The lead, the hook. Belloc, because he was a politician, I think he was in the House of Commons, Belloc the same way. Right, both of those men had ways of talking where they can get your attention, whereas someone like Dawson could be saying something much more profound. I think so, and even saying it out loud in a way that maybe Chesterton and Belloc in their own life and careers knew not to say explicitly. But he was more boring. He was more prosaic, and so that has to be factored in as well. We ought to revisit this. Why have Chesterton and Belloc been revived, whereas Dawson hasn't? I think as a working thesis, that has to do with it. Dawson said the name bourgeois and analyzed it, as we shall, and then he's also just, more long-winded. Okay, probably for the same reason that Augustine is not read. I mean, people blow wind about Augustine, but he's not read nearly as much as Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas was, like Chesterton and Belloc, more for the zingers, just in the way that he expressed himself with scholasticism. Okay, so I will also say this about my time in Ridgefield, which I write about in this text, which you can buy from Apocatastasis Press and Excess of Love. I will also say my 12 years with so-called traditional, so-called Catholicism did introduce me to this very niche type of Catholicism that you would see in the Distributist Review. The problem, and I think this is why I ultimately was moved on in the passive tense. I was moved on because if I was not booted out of Ridgefield, the school in particular, I was never asked to leave the church, but I was certainly told I was not going to have anything to do with the school any longer. If that did not happen all those 6 or 7 years ago, I probably would still be there. I mean, I could not bring myself to leave it once I start something. The only time I've ever stopped something or I've stopped it is because it isn't me doing it. It's because the person has died, or the business or whatever, or the church school has gone under. I've never, I mean, I guess you could find some hangnails here and there, but it's very much against the grain for me to ever leave something once it starts. So I guess it was a mercy on that Feast of St. Ignatius in 2018 to be booted out. It wasn't fun. Still not fun. I think about it a lot every day. But I probably would still be there. I don't know what you make of that. But anyway, from the time I was there, though, things like the Distributist Review, I'm very happy that I came across them. But yes. Even by then, I don't know if I could ever have pulled off the Band-Aid, so to speak, but I was becoming quite analytical, if not skeptical, about traditionalism, because I noticed that the ideas in the likes of the Distributist Review, the New Liturgical Review, paleoconservatism, they were not really popular in this place. And so there was this almost isolation within an isolation there. Anyway, I get into that in the book. I don't want to derail things here. Let's jump into the article. It's linked below in the description. In 1935, Christopher Dawson published a wonderful article with the title, Catholicism in the Bourgeois Mind. This has been reprinted. The note tells us in Christopher Dawson's The Dynamics of World History. Now, his article seems more relevant to Catholics in North America than ever it was today, for we are confronted with more clearly demarcated cultural choices now than 50 or even 20 years ago. Specifically, we see various subcultural groups espousing some of the ideals that Dawson considers a natural part of Catholic civilization, but for the most part, these groups have no connection with the Church, are not aware of their sometimes profound sympathy with important elements of Catholic culture, and more strange still, these groups and their very way of life are rejected by otherwise zealous and Orthodox Catholics. I will discuss this in more detail below after a short summary of Dawson's article. Dawson begins by stating that the bourgeois civilization and Catholic civilization are fundamentally opposed. That's the problem. That's the key. All of these works of betterment, religious, secular, educational, whatever, they are fundamentally opposed to the bourgeois way of thinking. That is why Ridgefield fell apart. That is why Mrs. Tortoise, every year since then, and for 100 years yet, will have to walk around there and not see high schoolers. Although they told me the high school is lately revived, it'll fall apart soon enough. It doesn't matter. All your prayers, all your masses, all your novenas are not going to keep that high school going, because the people staffing it, the parents, I shouldn't say the people staffing it. The problem isn't the priests. The problem isn't the teachers. The problem isn't the students. The problem with Ridgefield reviving its high school was the same problem when I was there. The parents are bourgeois. And the dynamics financially around that school are bourgeois. And if the bourgeois parents don't feel like paying their tuition, if they feel like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which is what the capitalists and the consumers are told to carry on like, well, you get Ridgefield. You get the old high school, you get whatever they have going on now. And Mrs. Tortoise will be going around that school for hundreds of years, and they're going to keep trying to revive that high school, and it will fall apart after 5 or 10 or 15 years every single time, because the fundamental souls of those combinations are bourgeois. And that's what Dawson is saying, and that's what Stork is encapsulating for us here, that the spirit of Catholicism and whatever work of betterment, the spirit of Islam, the spirit of Rabbinic Judaism, the spirit of Hare Krishna, the spirit of the Republican Party, the spirit of the Democratic Party, the spirit of the Green Party, the spirit of Native American religion, go on. I don't care what your ideology is. All of it, anything of goodness, in a wicked mood, maybe not the Democratic Party, but I'm just being silly here. The spirit of goodness and the spirit of the bourgeois are completely opposed. Literally, the word means, the word bourgeois means man of the city, which I could jag on about. But we say in English, we translate that or mistranslate or maybe transliterate it as middle class because of the socio-economical association. Well, the middle class man will never make anything but a middle soul. A middle class man could never make a saint. He could never make a hero in the classical mold. He could never make an artist of excellence. He could never do anything excellent because he is a middle man. In fact, the middle class, all they want for their children is to be middle men, to be managers. That's like their greatest thing, because then they could buy all sorts of things from other middle class people. But in this, there's nothing of excellence, because the Catholic civilization, insert your own ideological bailiwick, the Catholic civilization of excellence is absolutely antithetically opposed to the bourgeois civilization of middling men who go along to get along. Anyway, today, though, Stork says, our entire culture is permeated by bourgeois ideals. Yet if we look back at an earlier age when the bourgeoisie was merely one element within society, we can discern the particular characteristics of the bourgeois mind and see why that mind is so opposed to Catholicism. And that was the problem with Ridgefield. The problem is the parents who were, if they felt like it, the only fun. Let's just put it that way. Most of the parents didn't pay shit for the tuition that they were required to do, and the long-suffering teachers and the long-suffering priests and the long-suffering 501c3 corporate whore religious corporation which ran the school, they were all commendable for their patience. They wouldn't rock the boat, because we were, all of us, I was part of one of those three groups. We were all of us ideologues. We thought the whole time we were teaching Catholicism, and so we were. And the children, all those years, thought and acted like Catholics. The problem was the parents were bourgeois, and they destroyed that school, and they will destroy that school every single time Mrs. Tortoise goes around that school for the next 100, 200 years, probably, maybe 200 years. It will always be the parents, the bourgeois, middle class, middle management, middle thinking, non-heroic, non-holy, non-excellent parents who will destroy it. And whatever work of betterment you're involved with, and I'm involved with, will always crash itself on the rocks because of the inability to identify what Thomas Stork and what Christopher Dawson are bringing up, that any system of excellence and the middle class man of the city, the bourgeois, are absolutely opposed to each other. Features, what am I talking about? Features of the bourgeois mind. The first feature of the bourgeois mind that Dawson notes is its urbanism. Quote, it involves the divorce. That's a word I'm going to be talking about in a few months. I'm going to be talking about divorce and piety. Divorce, and I don't just mean marital divorce, maybe least of all, marital divorce. The bourgeois mind involves the divorce of man from nature and from the life of the earth. It turns the peasant into a minder of machines and the yeoman into a shopkeeper, until ultimately rural life becomes impossible and the very face of nature is changed by the destruction of the countryside and the pollution of the earth and the air and the waters. Secondly, the bourgeois spirit is characterized by a peculiar attitude towards economic life. Instead of having the love of the artist or the craftsman towards his work, the bourgeois regards the things he deals in as, quote, external and impersonal. He sees them only as objects of exchange, the value of which is to be measured exclusively in terms of money. It makes no difference whether he is dealing in works of art or cheap ready-made suits. All that matters is the volume of the transaction and the amount of profit to be derived from them. We'll recap all of these. Further, number 3, the bourgeois, quote, is essentially a money maker, at once its servant and its master. The development of his social ascendancy shows the degree to which civilization and human life are dominated by the money power. Dawson concludes his essay by explaining that a true Catholic civilization is dominated by a spirit of love for God, and expresses that love in vibrant art. The bourgeois does not know this word. The bourgeois does not know the adjective vibrant. He does not know the adjective holy. He does not know the adjective excellent. The Catholic knows those words. The Muslim knows those words. The American Indian, the dog-eating Chinaman, the Jew, they all know those words. The bourgeois does not know the word vibrant or holy or excellent. But for the Catholic in this article, he knows the word vibrance in art and music and various other economical means. Bourgeois civilization, on the other hand, will never rise above essentially worldly motives, which are middling motives. They're always middling motives, and maxims such as honesty is the best policy. The counterculture and Catholicism is the next section here. That was the problem. Why did Ridgefield fall apart? Why did Ridgefield fall apart? Because the parents who had undue power in that school, because of their occasional donations, I wouldn't even say they paid their tuition. Occasionally, they would throw a few coins to the desperate teachers and priests who still had, all of us had to deal with the capitalist moneymen for gasoline, for electricity, for the insurance, all of this. I remember one of the priests in the 501c3 corporate horror church that this place met in, this school met in, so-called school. The priest said that, actually, right? It cost $400. If he did the math, it cost $400 to open this building every morning. Do you think the middle class, fizzling, beige parents, do you think they cared? No, because they had to have their 3 dogs and their Netflix and their Blockbuster before that. This was in the transition period between Blockbuster and Netflix. Oh, they had to have their cars, and they had to have their, they all had gizmo. They all have their snacks, their top shelf snacks. Should I do that? Should I talk about their expenses? They all have DoorDash. They all have the internet, but they can't pay their they can't pay their priests and their teachers. Anyway, Dawson goes on here. Now, I think that no one, this is on Catholicism and the counterculture. Now, I think that no one will fail to notice that certain of the traits mentioned by Dawson as unbourgeois and akin to Catholic culture are very much prized by certain groups. And this is the nub, this is the key, whatever simile you want. The fact that there is tremendous sympathy, I think he uses that word, sympathy, between the counterculture and Catholicism, truly understood. But the problem is a lot of the people within Catholicism are bourgeois. And let's see where he's going here. I won't put words in his mouth. Okay, let's go back. Now, I think that no one will fail to notice that certain of the traits mentioned by Dawson as unbourgeois and akin to Catholic culture are very much prized by certain groups in these United States today. And I mean, of course, what is usually called the counterculture. The counterculture is not one single thing, but within it, there are groups strongly emphasizing virtues, such as the value of being close to nature and the life of the earth, not bringing about the destruction of the countryside and the pollution of the earth and the air and the waters, and of having the attitude of the artist or craftsman towards one's work. I think that it is very unfortunate that these people, and this is Dawson talking, do not recognize their affinity with Catholic culture, and affinity manifested also, actually I think this is Dawson, also on the pan of some of their attitudes toward contraceptives, the government school system, I don't like that term, but this is Dawson talking, cooperative economical enterprises, breastfeeding, and so forth. This is a loss for them and for us in the church. This is the nub. This is the nub, this section here. That there is a fundamental sympathy between actual Catholic culture and various denominations of the counterculture. However, those Catholics are bourgeois, and therefore they write off large swaths of people. I didn't say ideologies, thoughts, practice. I said people, human beings that would otherwise become Catholic. But the bourgeois, whom the church has associated with for the past 300 odd years since the French Revolution, they want nothing to do with the counterculture. Let's go on with Dawson here. They are deprived in the first place of the counterculture of many of the benefits of membership in Christ's mystical body, which is the Catholic Church, but also of the key to their critique of the modern Western life. We are deprived of brothers in the faith. We, the Catholics in this author's audience, who have valuable things. Again, I'm not really hung up on the Catholic thing for this presentation. Put in whatever. You're a Democrat. You're whatever you think is good. You're going to notice the exact same themes here. We are deprived of brothers in the faith who have valuable things to teach us, but also of possible allies who could do much to help outflank our enemies, the secularists. And in this, I absolutely agree with Dawson that the enemy is secularism. And people who cannot organize a common front against secularism are not getting it. Getting to certain, certainly controversial points in the beginning of this presentation. Western Christians have lost almost every aspect of society. And so what they end up doing is fetishizing, if you forgive the language, because I know it's very sexual. That word, fetish, unfortunately, has been limited to the sexual. I don't mean it in that way. But Western Christians have fetishized, yes, the sexual dynamic of life, which is still private, and the doctrinal which in liberalism is essentially private as long as you don't cross any of the tripwires of liberalism. So modern Western Christians of whatever flavor are obsessed about sex, and they're obsessed about doctrine. And unfortunately, this leads to huge amounts of wasted energy, because if you cannot see that secularism is the problem, well, you are the problem, not to otherize you. Anyway, secularism is the problem. Everything needs to be put under that umbrella, in my opinion. And a lot of people, not just Christians, of whatever flavor, and I think that's just a sign of the times, because we're not reading as much. We're less able to make these distinctions and to organize on more fundamental principles. That's a big thing. We cannot organize against secularism because, well, I guess that's the running theme of this broadcast. We are fundamentally a lot more part of the problem than we imagine. We are bourgeois. We are, and I don't even want to, in this comment, focus on the bourgeois stuff, but we ourselves are fundamentally shaped by the errors of our generation. And that's why we're not able to see the forest for the trees. We're not able to see that secularism is the fundamental problem. And we're not able to put aside secondary, tertiary concerns in light of that. But, and I do believe this is the second time we've seen this typographically. You see there's a typo here. I don't think this is actually the author's typo. I think this is just the website. This website has not been updated for over 10 years. So I think some of the coding is breaking down. So when you see this, which should have a space here, I actually think, because we saw this before if you were paying close attention, I actually think this is where a new paragraph ought to begin. But there are only two ways these people could find out that Catholicism is their natural home. One is by reading about Catholic things, not only writers such as Dawson, Belloc, and Chesterton, already named, but even old manuals for Catholic parents, Exemplar Gratia, which recommended breastfeeding in the 40s and 50s of the last century, when almost no one was nursing her baby. But for numerous reasons, few of these bourgeois counterculture people, that's whom they're referring to, few substantive pronoun, but for these reasons, few people attracted to counterculture are going to discover these books. Even the most well-known and largely ignored by the general establishment, bourgeoisie, culture, and unless... Excuse me, I went too fast there. Even the most well-known of these above authors, this is another substantive pronoun, that's why I tripped up. So the word few is a substantive, and the most well-known. Right, so the few refers to the counterculture. The most well-known, substantive pronoun, refer to old-fashioned Catholic authors who ought to be rediscovered, are largely ignored by the general bourgeois establishment. And unless the counterculture, should come into contact with our Catholic subculture, they will not even know that such a man as Dawson existed, much less what he had to say. Which brings me to the second way. The other way these people, counterculture, could discover that Catholicism is their real home, which is the home of every man on this earth, is by seeing that nearly all Catholics live lives which reject bourgeois values. And that is why Ridgefield failed. And that is why your pro-life work fails. I dare say that is why your Planned Parenthood work fails. I'm trying to be ecumenical here in many ways. I'm trying to make a very deep nerve level, spine level analysis of what's going on. So I'm being ecumenical in that regard. But all works of whatever we consider betterment are constantly falling flat because we are fundamentally bourgeois in our values. No matter what superficial clothing, whatever cheap clothing we cover ourselves with, we are fundamentally bourgeois. And until that nerve is pressed, we're going to keep fizzling out. And there is for the counterculture, they don't know that there is a Catholic counterculture which militantly stands up for many of the values they hold dear, yet with more consistency and for more complete reasons. But alas, where will they find such a body of Catholics? Stork says. Of course, there are some groups that do exemplify all facets of Catholic culture. Maybe I kind of hinted at it. Maybe part of the problem of Catholicism, and this is not a real problem, but you play with it. Part of it, it's such an encompassing idea. Most people are nincompoops that can't really get the enormity or the totalitarianism of Catholicism. I think that's a large problem that we're facing here as well. Anyway, rather, if the counterculture sorts look towards Catholics in America, what are they going to see? What did we see in Ridgefield? These were supposed to be the most hardcore Catholics in Western Connecticut and Eastern New York. The people who came to this church, who came to this high school, these flattered themselves to their own hubris. These sorts of people flattered themselves that they were the hardcore of the hardcore. And in fact, as I write about in this book, there was actually a schism within this parish. And there was a hardcore of a hardcore of a hardcore, which broke off and started another traditional Catholic so-called parish. Right? The reality is, again and again, they were all bourgeois. And that's why it fell apart. That's why Ridgefield failed and fizzled. The first group, let's go back here. I want to jump ahead. Rather, if they look towards Catholics in America, they will see two groups, each engaged in articulating a vision of Catholicism and each involved in a discussion of the many political, social, and moral issues facing us today. Okay, so you're the counterculture. Whatever you consider the counterculture, the secular counterculture, you're looking at Catholicism and you're seeing two different groups. The first group are heterodox neo-modernist Catholics, a clique in this article, unfortunately so prevalent in 2012. I don't think you can say that now. That's largely died off because the baby boomers have aged out. But as of this writing, with them, the people of the counterculture might at first feel some kinship. For the neo-modernist Catholics, in general, probably fear the counterculture in general, but only for the same reasons that non-Catholic secular liberals do. Here's another breakdown of coding, I think. This should be a dash. I don't think this is a badly edited article. I think it's the code that's breaking down. Namely, why does the secular liberal sort have antipathy? Okay, because it is. Oh no, hold on. Why is the secular liberal countercultural sort initially finding simpatico with the neo-modernist heterodox sorts that Stork identifies? Namely, because it is new, different, and so they think opposed to traditional Western civilization, by which they mean whatever was done and thought in 1955. But were these heretics to take a good look at the counterculture, or at least at certain elements within it, I think they might be distressed at what they saw. So, though there doubtless is some fraternizing between liberal Catholics and counterculturalists, I think this is based on a superficial acquaintance by both parties as to the real aims of each other group. The other articulate group of Catholics, this is the second group. So if you're a secular countercultural sort, this is the second type that you're coming across. The first are your neo-modernist heterodox sorts. That's Stork's language, right? And you initially think you have a simpatico with them, but fundamentally you have deeper aims, and those are different aims. The other sort, and this is the one Stork is mainly concerned with in this article, is the group which vehemently eschews Catholic dogmatic heterodoxy and adheres strongly to the Church's magisterium. This is exactly the sort of bourgeois that filled out this high school, particularly parentally. And unfortunately, another discussion for another day, unfortunately, the parents were as the bourgeois nursery rhyme says, with the Piper story, which I'm blanking on, right? He who pays the piper calls the tune. What is the nursery rhyme with the piper who leads the children through the town with the flute? It used to be like folk wisdom. It's not Peter the Piper. Pied Piper. It's a Pied Piper. Unfortunately, the Pied Pipers of this failed high school were bourgeois, and they were, when they felt like it, when they felt like making a donation on their tuition, you know, they would throw a few coins, and we were so desperate. Everyone was desperate in that time. In the book here, I get into it. I mean, the state of my automobile was, I mean, there were times it was puffing smoke and overheating. I'm not talking once or twice or thrice, because these useless bourgeois parents who were running the roost, you know, we were all desperate for whatever Federal Reserve notes we could get. And their parsimony and their spirit and their heart, such as it was, is what destroyed Ridgefield, and it is what destroys every work of betterment that tries to nest amongst the bourgeois, right? These were people that vehemently eschewed, yes, vocally, they vehemently eschewed dogmatic heterodoxy, which is a roundabout way of saying they were orthodox. These people in Ridgefield were strong adherents to the, well, no, no, this group was not, but they believed they were. To their credit, you know, in their minds, like every Protestant, they believed they were Catholic. You could not call a traditional Catholic Orthodox in the magisterial sense whatsoever, which is why you'll never hear them talk about Vatican I. But in their minds, I don't want to get into the whole traditional Catholic thing, because that's not my main nerve that I'm pressing on here. In their minds, they believed they were, not being ironic, more Catholic than the Pope. But that would involve a whole other discussion of the whole traditional sect. Anyway, in addition to that, this group, super hardcore, you know, at least in their understanding, Catholics, in addition to that, this sort reads Catholic authors such as Dawson, Belloc, Chesterton, and members of this group. In many cases, they attempt to steep themselves in Catholic culture and traditions, what I called the aesthetic earlier. And they are aware that there is these ones are especially aware, and this was definitely the case in Ridgefield. They were Protestants. They were Protestants who were really hot for the Catholic aesthetic, but they were fundamentally Protestants. But to their credit, they were aware of a great gulf separating modern Western life, secular life, from Catholic civilization. Yet, with some notable exceptions, members of this group, right, the so-called traditional, so-called Catholics, whatever flattering adjectives, sometimes seem to possess the bourgeois character. Here we go. This is the key of the key. This is the skeleton key that opens the skeleton key. And this is exactly what I identified why the high school failed in Ridgefield. Let it illumine our subsequent works. Members of this sort of group of Catholics sometimes seem to possess the bourgeois character to a greater degree than the population in general. Not only are they bourgeois, they are, you know, these groups weren't just more Catholic than the Pope, but they were more bourgeois than the bourgeois. They oppose not just excessive, they oppose not just the excesses of the environmentalists, but sometimes the entire cause of environmentalism. Look at how these so-called adjective Catholics behave towards Laudato Si of Pope Francis, Lord have mercy on him. Look, this was a magisterial document, and they bucked up against it because those sorts didn't just write off the excesses of the environmentalists. As good bourgeois, they wrote off everything about environmentalism. And you can go back in this recording and go back in Stork's article and go back in Dawson's original piece, all of them linked below. And you'll see why, because the bourgeois sees nature as something to be conquered. And these so-called Catholics were fundamentally bourgeois. They were only superficially Catholic. So when the Catholic Pope issues an encyclical Laudato Si, which is a parsing of St. Francis's prayer, so-called, authored by St. Francis, I will praise you, extolling environmentalism, these bourgeois Catholics had no way to digest it, so they rejected it all. And so these super magisterial Catholics, exactly to Stork's point, wrote off everything of environmentalism. They tend to look upon the counterculture as useless, faddish, self-indulgent, and eccentric. In this book, I describe what I think is, in our lifetimes, Every one of you watching, I don't care how young you are, how old you are, in all of our lifetimes, there will be nothing to illustrate, and there will be no time in history where the left, the true, authentic left, was closer to Catholicism than Occupy in North America and in other parts of the world. The Occupy movement and actual Catholic social teaching were profoundly sympathetic in their aims. And if you want to see this in action to this last sentence, they tend to see the counterculture as useless, faddish, self-indulgent, and eccentric. Look at how the flatteringly adjective traditional Catholics, conservative Catholics, Orthodox Catholics, look at how, at that time, they behaved towards Occupy. They wrote it off. I was there. I was at the latter parts of Occupy Wall Street, and I was also in the traditional so-called Catholic so-called world. And it was a tremendous tragedy for me personally to see the left, the secular people, the secular counterculture. They had nothing. They didn't have oomph to say. They didn't have a bad word to say about these Christians. But I tell you, at that time, the 501c3 corporate whore traditional Catholics, they had nothing but vitriol to give at Occupy. I remember it. I mean, I literally would go from masses, and afterwards they were trashing Occupy Wall Street, and then you would go down to Manhattan on May Day, which was, by the way, a first-class feast in the so-called traditional calendar of the Western Church. And there would be no traditional Catholics there, but there would be leftist, secularist, countercultural people who were verbing and advocating and sacrificing and going to jail for traditional Catholic principles. It was a tremendous sorrow for me. It really was. I get into it in the book. But I got into it right now. You got what I'm coming from. Anyway, this is a long sentence. Too often, in a semicolon, they ally themselves with right-wing groups that are thoroughly bourgeois and that stand for laissez-faire capitalism and its concomitant, great word, attitudes and values. That's the problem with all of these flattering adjective hardcore Catholics. They ally themselves with right-wing groups that are thoroughly bourgeois and that stand for laissez-faire capitalism and its concomitant attitudes and values. Only in their attitude towards contraception and their valuing of large families and maybe breastfeeding will there be found much of a bond between them, the flattering adjectives, and the counterculture. But why is this so? Why is it that these Catholics, who are in possession of the very key to their correct critique of bourgeois culture, do they not see the implications of that critique? While the counterculture intuits and feels the wrongness of certain things, right? You see this in the secular counterculture. They feel in their bones that there's something wrong with fracking, that there's something wrong with bottled milk, so-called, that there's something wrong with vaccines. The secular counterculture sees that. But they don't have any of the knowledge of the underlying principles of their rebellion. As to the first of these questions, I think the answer has two parts. Orthodox Catholics are very often people to reject things such as a craft approach to work and a concern for ecology, because here we go. So why did the traditional so-called Catholics, why did they reject, and why do they reject, present tense, the counterculture? Because the people they see who promote these things, in some cases also promote drugs, Eastern religions, unchastity, etc., etc. Most people only with this is another key. This is not the key. This is not the key within the key, but I would say this is another thing that is well worth meditating on in silence. This sentence. Most people only with difficulty and with deliberate effort can separate in thought things they habitually see conjoined in fact. It's another discussion for another day. But in my book on nudism, I see very similar sympathy between the fundamental aims of Catholicism, East and West, and naturism. And I can tell you, with great scars on my body, the truth of this sentence. Most people, only with a difficulty and with deliberate effort, can separate in thought things they habitually see conjoined in fact. If you want me to give that presentation, please write me at ApocatastasisInstitute at AOL.com, because it presses very much on the point of this article. Stork goes on, yet, for these people, it is perfectly possible for someone... No, this is an objective statement by Stork. Yet it is perfectly possible for someone to believe some true things and some false things. And this is true of movements too. They can be in part right and part wrong. Traditional Catholics, right? So traditional Catholics are, canonically speaking, Protestants. They don't hold up the Holy Bible as a fetish, but rather the Holy Liturgy. If you want to be really nice on a really good day with a really good night's sleep under your wings, you can say they're kind of like Orthodox, Western Orthodox, right? People can believe true things and false things. Not just the counterculture that is true for. You can be truly trying to follow Christ and have all sorts of detritus. And that was part of the problem of why Ridgefield failed. Anyway, and this is true of movements too. They can be part right, part wrong. The second reason, I think, is simply that the way of life of most of the Orthodox group, lowercase o, of Catholics is so different from what the counterculture aspires to. And that this strangeness creates a distrust and lack of sympathy. Since everyone living what is considered an ordinary life in modern Western society is more or less thoroughly bourgeois, as Dawson points out, even in 1932, 1952, I don't know, I'm getting my dyslexia here, but a long time ago, it is he was pointing that out a long time ago. It is natural for Orthodox Catholics, likewise leading this bourgeois existence, to see this kind of life as the norm. That's why Ridgefield failed. That's why our works of betterment fail again and again and again. Switch out whatever good ideas you have, whatever good practices you have. The problem is that we are all living bourgeois lives. And this makes us very on edge when people critique that. Age doubtless has something to do with it, since most of the people of a certain age were not affected by the experiences that produced the counterculture and have consequently little sympathy with it. And as of this point, most people in the Orthodox Catholic resistance, at least those who articulate its politics and goals, know of the counterculture only through reading, only through videos, only through films. Here we go. Let's bring it home. What can be done? What will prevent high schools, holy works with Mrs. Tortoise, from replicating themselves? What will prevent this failure from repeating? How can we have the next 200 years maybe for Mrs. Tortoise? Her lifespan has extended in the in this broadcast. It used to be 100 years if you were paying attention. What can we do to keep Mrs. Tortoise from seeing the next 200 years of failed Catholic high schools on Lake Memenasco from rising and falling every 5 to 15 years? Well, Thomas Stork has our answer, and so does Christopher Dawson. If the situation is generally as I suggest here, what can be done? That definitely is a breakdown of coding, by the way. There should be a comma here. I really don't believe this is badly type edited. I think it's literally the website is decomposing before our eyes. Well, perhaps naively, what can be done? Perhaps naively, I think we must begin to evangelize the counterculture and enlighten our fellow Catholics. As the second begins to succeed, as the evangelization begins to succeed, the first will be done more easily. Will it be easy to do the second? Hold on, let's go back there. Yeah, the second point here is, okay, if the situation is generally as suggested here, what can be done? Well, perhaps we must begin to evangelize the counterculture and enlighten our fellow Catholics. Okay, got it. As the second begins, the enlightenment of Catholics, the first will be done more easily. It will be easier to evangelize the secular counterculture. Will it be easy to do the second, in a sense, to evangelize the Catholics? The fact that the counterculture has a lot more to do with traditional Catholicism, authentically, not quote unquote, authentically known, the fact that the counterculture and its concerns are fundamentally sympathetic to truly traditional Catholic culture. Will it be easy to do the second? Probably not. It will probably be harder to reach the bourgeois who goes to the Latin Mass and says his rosary every day. It will be harder to convince that man that the counterculture girl with rainbow hair and armpit hair and socialism and breastfeeding and nudism and growing a garden in her backyard or his backyard, whatever. It will be hard to convince the first guy in the Latin Mass and the Rosary that that person with the rainbow hair and the garden is their best friend. That is actually going to be harder than to convince herself with the armpit hair and the nudism and maybe a few abortions under her belt. It will actually be easier to reach that girl with the septum. I'm just being stereotypical here. It will be easier to reach that one with the truth than it will be to convince the guy in his three-piece suit and his 7 traditional Catholic kids that I'll tell you about on YouTube. Right? So that's the reality. It's going to be harder to convince the superficial followers of Christ. Yet, really, all it will take is to get them to pay attention to certain themes and passages in the authors like Chesterton and Belloc and Dawson, indeed, than they already read. But I have greater hope that as more people whose formation was affected in a good way in a good way. I'm not stuttering, and neither is Stork. In a good way, that their formation was affected in a good way by the counterculture's critique of American society, will attain positions of leadership or influence amongst Orthodox Catholics. They will help cast off the present bourgeois associations and look to the counterculture, both to teach and to learn. So the hope here is not with the so-called traditional Christians of whatever flavor or whatever goodness here, and to the overarching umbrella of this presentation. I'm not really caught up on the Catholic stuff, but whatever you consider true and good and socially beneficial, put that in, just substitute. It will be easier to get people from that world who are honest and see the goodness of that counterculture, including secularism, in fairness. Even Pope Benedict, Lord have mercy on him, spoke of a healthy secularism. It will be easier to get those people than those of us in 1,000 denominations, educationally, religiously, politically, socially, who are right, or right-wing, God help us, to see the opposite. So that is a truly evangelical article, what we've just gotten through in the last stretch. And I hope you read it. It's down below in the description. Catholics and the Bourgeois Mind. And then perhaps you'll boogie-woogie over to Apocatastasis's Press. You'll buy In Excess of Love, which deals with my 12 years in traditional Catholicism, 11 of them at that so-called Catholic school. And then perhaps the sequel of sorts is Pearls Before Swine, which deals with a much more painful, much more temporally condensed incident, but dealing with the very same energies, but in a much more diamond-like fashion in New Fairfield. So Ridgefield, disgraced Ridgefield, is the subject of An Excess of Love, and disgraced New Fairfield is the subject of Pearls Before Swine. And in each and all instance, I wish great blessings and prayers and benedictions upon Mrs. Tortoise and upon all of the teachers and priests and students from that dead high school, from the dear dead days gone by. I wish nothing but humiliation, defeat, conquest, and everything wicked and bad upon the parents who destroyed the hopes of those clergy, teachers, and students and Mrs. Tortoise as well. May all of their bourgeois spirit and heart and mind, may all of it come back upon them, and it certainly will in their old age. With all of that cryptic imprecation being seen, Chu, thank you for your attention here. This has gone on for about 3 times as long as I wanted, and probably as much as you wanted. But thank you for this, and check out the links below. And as St. Thomas More said, may God find us in heaven, and as St. Ignatius of Loyola said, if I can click on the exit button, may we all discern spirits, bourgeois, traditional Catholic, democratic, turtle, child, whatever the case may be. Masalama, God bless.